On March 14th, 2003, a 62-year-old farmer named Vernon Kleist stood at the back of a farm dispersal auction in Moultrie County, Illinois, watching three men in their 40s laugh at him. The men were neighbors. They farmed operations between 1,800 and 3,200 acres each. They ran John Deere 8000 series tractors, newer combines, GPS guidance systems that cost more than Vernon's first land purchase. And they were laughing because Vernon had just raised his hand and bought a 1987 Massey Ferguson 3680 for $8,900. The tractor sat on the auction lot with rust showing through the red paint on both fenders. The front axle had a slow leak. One hydraulic line was wrapped in electrical tape. The seat cushion was split down the middle with duct tape holding the foam in place. The hour meter read 9,640. The engine was a Perkins six-cylinder diesel that started on the third crank and blew a small puff of black smoke before settling into a rough idle that smoothed out after 30 seconds. The auctioneer had opened bidding at $12,000. Nobody moved. He dropped to $10,000. Still nothing. At $8,500, Vernon raised his card. A man near the front turned around and said loud enough for 20 people to hear, "Someone actually wants that thing." At $8,900, the auctioneer said sold and pointed at Vernon. The three neighbors standing near the equipment trailer were still laughing when Vernon walked to the cashier table and wrote a check. One of them, a man named Todd Messner, who farmed 2,100 acres and ran two John Deere 8300s, walked over as Vernon was folding his receipt. "Vernon, what the hell are you doing with that?" Todd said. Vernon looked at him. "Farming," he said. Todd shook his head. "That thing won't make it through one season of real work." Vernon put the receipt in his shirt pocket. "We'll see," he said. The other two neighbors, Kyle Reinhardt and Greg Bachman, came over. Kyle farmed 1,800 acres. Greg farmed 3,200. Both of them financed new equipment every 4 to 5 years. Both of them carried debt loads. Vernon had stopped trying to calculate because the numbers made him uncomfortable just thinking about them. "Vernon, seriously," Greg said. "That's a 20-year-old tractor. You're going to spend more fixing it than it's worth." Vernon said, "Maybe." Kyle said, "There's no maybe. That's junk. You should have let it go to scrap." Vernon didn't argue. He just walked out to the lot, climbed into the Massey Ferguson, started it, and drove it home on county roads at 18 miles per hour, while newer tractors passed him pulling empty trailers back from the same auction. If you're watching this because you remember a time when equipment lasted longer than the payment book, when maintenance meant something, and when a farmer's word was still worth more than a financing agreement, then you're in the right place. This channel exists because those stories matter. Because the machines that get laughed at sometimes outlast the ones that get praised. Because 10 years is a long time in farming, and what looks like junk in year 1 doesn't always look like junk in year 10. If that's the kind of story you want to hear, subscribe. We're not going anywhere. We're just getting started. Vernon Kleist had been farming the same 680 acres in Moultrie County since 1964. He'd bought the land with money saved from working construction and a loan his father co-signed at the bank in Sullivan. The first tractor he ever owned was a 1958 Farmall 560. He bought used in 1965 for $3,800. He ran that tractor for 19 years. When it finally quit in 1984, he bought a used John Deere 4440 for $18,500 and ran it until 1996. Then he bought a used Massey Ferguson 3650 for $22,000 and ran it until 2003. Vernon did not buy new equipment. He did not finance unless he absolutely had to, and when he did finance, he paid it off early. His operating philosophy was simple: buy used, maintain obsessively, run until it quits, then fix it and keep running. His neighbors operated differently. They bought new. They traded every 4 to 6 years. They financed at promotional rates and rolled the remaining balance into the next deal. They had equipment with air-conditioned cabs, touchscreen displays, auto steer, variable rate technology. Vernon had a tractor with a cracked seat and a radio that didn't work. The Massey Ferguson 3680 arrived at Vernon's farm on March 15, 2003. He backed it into his machine shed next to the 3650, which had thrown a rod through the block 2 weeks earlier and was now a $6,400 paperweight waiting to be sold for parts. Vernon spent the next 3 days inspecting what he'd bought. He changed the engine oil and found it cleaner than he expected. He pulled the hydraulic filter and found metal shavings, which meant the previous owner had run it hard or hadn't changed the filter on schedule. He replaced the filter, flushed the hydraulic system, and refilled it with fresh fluid. He pulled all 4 fuel injectors, tested them, cleaned them, reinstalled them. He checked the air filter. It was clogged. He replaced it. He greased every fitting he could find, 42 of them. He checked the front axle seals and found one leaking. He ordered the parts from a Massey Ferguson dealer in Decatur, waited 4 days for them to arrive, then replaced both seals and refilled the front differential. He inspected the clutch. It was worn but functional. He adjusted the linkage. He checked the brakes. The pads were at 30%. He ordered new pads, installed them, bled the system. By March 22nd, Vernon had spent $1,840 in parts and materials. Total investment, $10,740. He took the Massey Ferguson out to the field and started preseason tillage. The tractor pulled a 14-foot disc through 120 acres of corn stubble without hesitation. The engine ran smooth. The hydraulics responded. The transmission shifted clean. Vernon worked 12-hour days, and the Massey Ferguson worked beside him without complaint. On March 28th, Vernon was fueling the tractor at the co-op in Sullivan when Todd Messner pulled up in his truck. Todd climbed out, looked at the Massey Ferguson, and shook his head. "You actually using that thing?" Todd said. "Every day," Vernon said. "How's it running?" "Fine." Todd laughed. "Give it time, Vernon. That motor's going to let go. Then you'll be looking at a $15,000 rebuild on a tractor worth $8,000. Vernon finished fueling and drove back to the field. Planting season in 2003 was late and wet. Vernon used the Massey Ferguson to pull a 12-row planter through fields that turned to mud after every rain. The tractor handled it. The four-wheel drive kept traction. The engine pulled steady at 1900 RPM. Vernon finished planting on May 17th, 3 days behind schedule, but within the window. His neighbors with the newer equipment finished earlier, but not by much. Summer came dry. The corn grew slowly. Yields across the county were projected down 15 to 20%. Vernon's farm was no exception. He combined in October and hauled to the elevator in Sullivan. The price was $2.18 a bushel. Vernon did the math and realized he'd barely covered costs. It wasn't a good year. But it wasn't a disaster either. He paid his bills. He kept the farm, and the Massey Ferguson ran through harvest without breaking down. In November, Vernon was at the parts counter in Decatur picking up filters when the service manager, a man named Ron Halstead, walked over. Ron had been with the dealership for 14 years. He knew Vernon by name. "I heard you bought that 3680 at the Kleinhammer auction," Ron said. "I did," Vernon said. Ron looked at the filter boxes Vernon was holding. "You doing your own service?" "Always have." Ron nodded. "That tractor's got some miles on it. You planning to run it hard?" "I'm planning to run it," Vernon said. Ron smiled in a way that wasn't quite friendly. "Well, when it blows up, bring it in. We'll get you into something newer." Vernon paid for the filters and left. The first year passed. Then the second. The Massey Ferguson accumulated hours. 10,000, 11,000, 12,000. Vernon changed the oil every 150 hours. He changed the hydraulic filter every 300 hours. He replaced the air filter every season. He greased every fitting before every use. He checked fluid levels every morning. He did not skip maintenance. He did not defer service. He did not ignore warning signs. In 2004, the clutch finally gave out. Vernon pulled the transmission, replaced the clutch disc and pressure plate, reassembled everything, and had the tractor back in the field in 3 days. Total cost, $680 in parts. In 2005, the alternator failed. Vernon replaced it himself, 140 use. In 2006, a hydraulic line burst during spring planting. Vernon replaced the line, bled the system, and was back to work by afternoon. $85. These were not catastrophic failures. These were normal wear items on a tractor that was now 20 years old and working full-time on a 680-acre operation. Vernon's neighbors, the ones who had laughed at him in 2003, were on different schedules. Todd Messner traded both of his John Deere 8300s in 2007 for two 8430s. Total financed amount, $340,000. Kyle Reinhardt traded his equipment in 2006. Greg Bachman traded in 2008. They were farming larger operations. They needed more horsepower, more capacity, more technology, and they were paying for it. By 2008, the Massey Ferguson had 13,200 hours on it. Vernon was 67 years old. He'd been farming for 44 years. He had no debt. His equipment was paid for. His land was paid for. His son Aaron, who was 36 and worked as an electrician in Champaign, had told Vernon he wasn't interested in taking over the farm. Vernon understood. Farming had changed. The margins were tighter. The equipment was more expensive. The risk was higher. Aaron had a good job, a family, a life that didn't involve worrying about rain in July or commodity prices in November. Vernon kept farming because he didn't know what else to do. And the Massey Ferguson kept running because Vernon didn't know how to maintain equipment any other way. In March of 2009, Vernon was dissing a field along Route 32 when a truck pulled over and a man got out. Vernon finished his pass, then idled down and waited. The man walked across the ditch and stood at the fence. It was Ron Halstead, the service manager from the Massey Ferguson dealership in Decatur. "Vernon," Ron said. "Ron," Vernon said. Ron looked at the tractor. "That's the same 3680 you bought in '03, isn't it?" "It is." "How many hours on it now?" 13,400. Ron was quiet for a moment. "And you haven't had any major work done?" "Clutch in '04, alternator in '05, hydraulic lines, normal stuff." Ron walked closer. "Can I take a look?" Vernon shut the tractor down and climbed off. Ron walked around the machine slowly. He looked at the tires, the paint, the engine compartment. He checked the oil. He looked at the hydraulic reservoir. He inspected the air filter housing. "You're doing all the service yourself?" Ron asked. "Every bit of it," Vernon said. Ron shook his head. "I told you this thing wouldn't last 2 seasons. Vernon didn't say anything. Ron looked at him. "I was wrong." Vernon nodded. Ron said, "What are you doing differently?" Vernon said, "Nothing. I just changed the oil." Ron stood there for another moment, then walked back to his truck and left. Vernon climbed back onto the Massey Ferguson and went back to work. The years that followed were not easy years. Grain prices spiked in 2008, then crashed in 2009. The recession hit. Credit tightened. Input costs stayed high while commodity prices dropped. Farmers who had expanded aggressively in the mid-2000s were suddenly underwater. Some of them sold equipment. Some of them sold land. Some of them walked away entirely. Vernon's neighbors were not immune. In 2010, Kyle Reinhardt sold 400 acres to cover operating loans. In 2011, Greg Bachman filed for bankruptcy and lost everything. The farm that had been in his family for 3 generations was sold at auction in April 2012. Todd Messner survived, but only by refinancing his land and consolidating debt. He stopped buying new equipment. He started running his tractors longer. He started doing more of his own maintenance. Vernon kept farming his 680 acres the same way he always had. He planted in the spring. He harvested in the fall. He maintained his equipment through the winter. The Massey Ferguson kept running. 13,500 hours. 14,000. 14,200. In 2013, Vernon was at the co-op in Sullivan when Todd Messner walked over. Todd looked older. The confidence he'd carried in 2003 was gone. He looked tired. "Vernon," Todd said. "Todd," Vernon said. Todd looked out at the parking lot where the Massey Ferguson was parked. "That's the same tractor you bought 10 years ago, isn't it?" "It is." Todd was quiet for a moment. "I remember laughing at you." Vernon said, "I remember." Todd said, "I was an idiot." Vernon didn't disagree. Todd said, "How much have you put into it?" "Total." Vernon thought about it. "Parts and maintenance over 10 years? Maybe $4,800. Todd looked at him. "That's it?" "That's it." Todd said, "I've spent $680,000 on equipment in the same 10 years, and I'm still making payments." Vernon said, "I know." Todd said, "You tried to tell us." Vernon said, "No, I didn't. I just bought what I could afford and kept it running." Todd walked back to his truck. Vernon never saw him at the co-op again. He heard later that Todd had scaled back, sold some ground, and taken a part-time job at the elevator to make ends meet. By 2015, the Massey Ferguson had 14,600 hours on it. Vernon was 74 years old. His knees hurt, his back hurt. He couldn't work the hours he used to. But he still planted every spring, he still harvested every fall, and the Massey Ferguson still started every morning. In June of that year, Vernon's son Aaron called and said he was coming down for the weekend. Aaron arrived on a Saturday with his wife and 2 daughters. They walked the farm, looked at the fields, ate lunch in the farmhouse kitchen where Vernon had eaten lunch for 51 years. After lunch, Aaron asked to see the equipment. Vernon took him out to the machine shed. The Massey Ferguson sat in the same bay it had occupied since 2003. Aaron walked around it slowly. "This is the one you bought at auction?" Aaron asked. "It is," Vernon said. "How long ago?" 12 years. Aaron looked at the hour meter. 14,000 hours. 14.6. Aaron shook his head. "Dad, this thing's ancient." Vernon said, "It runs." Aaron said, "When are you going to retire?" Vernon said, "When I can't do it anymore." Aaron looked at his father. "And then what happens to the farm?" Vernon said. "I don't know yet." They walked back to the house. Aaron and his family left that evening. Vernon stood in the driveway watching the taillights disappear and understood that the farm would not stay in the family. Aaron had his own life. His daughters were 8 and 6. They'd never lived in the country. They didn't know what farming was. Vernon didn't blame them. The world had changed. Farming had changed. And the Massey Ferguson, sitting in his shed, was a relic from a time that didn't exist anymore, except on farms like his, where old men ran old equipment and somehow made it work. In 2016, Vernon listed the farm for sale. 680 acres, house, outbuildings, equipment. Asking price $2.8 million. The realtor put up a sign. A few people came to look. Nobody made an offer. Months passed. In September, a young farmer named Jason Deerfield called. Jason was 32 years old. He farmed 800 acres with his father and wanted to expand. He came to walk the property. Jason spent 2 hours inspecting the land, checking tile lines, looking at soil reports. Then he walked out to the machine shed. Vernon showed him the equipment: a grain cart, a planter, a disc, a field cultivator, the combine, and the Massey Ferguson 3680. Jason walked around the tractor. "Does this run?" Jason asked. Vernon started it. The engine fired on the second crank. Jason listened. "That sounds good." Vernon shut it down. Jason said, "What year is it?" 1987. Jason looked at the hour meter. 14.8. Vernon nodded. Jason said, "If I buy the farm, I want this tractor included." Vernon said, "It's part of the package." Jason said, "No, I specifically want this one. Not the combine, not the other stuff, this." They agreed on a price. The sale closed in November 2016. On the day Vernon moved off the farm, he loaded his truck with boxes, furniture, personal items. He was moving to a small house in Sullivan, a place with no land, no shop, no equipment. Jason Deerfield arrived in the afternoon to take possession. Vernon handed him the keys to the house, the keys to the equipment. They stood in the machine shed. "That Massey Ferguson," Vernon said. "Change the oil every 150 hours. Change the hydraulic filter every 300. Grease the fittings before every use. Don't skip it. Don't defer it." Jason said, "I won't." Vernon said, "It'll run as long as you take care of it." Jason said, "I believe you." Vernon walked to his truck and drove into town. He didn't look back. In March of 2017, 4 months after Vernon sold the farm, Ron Halstead from the Massey Ferguson dealership in Decatur drove out to Jason Deerfield's farm unannounced. Jason was in the shop working on the planter when Ron pulled up. Ron got out and walked over. "Jason Deerfield?" Ron asked. "That's me. I'm Ron Halstead. I manage the service department at Greenway Implement in Decatur." Jason wiped his hands. "What can I do for you?" Ron said. "I heard you bought Vernon Kleist's farm." "I did." "And you got his equipment?" "Some of it." Ron looked around the shop. "Is the 3680 here?" Jason pointed. The Massey Ferguson sat in the corner bay. Ron walked over to it. He looked at the hour meter. 4,920. He opened the engine cowling. He checked the oil. He looked at the air filter. He inspected the hydraulic reservoir. "You running this?" Ron asked. "Every day," Jason said. Ron shook his head. "Unbelievable." Jason said, "What's unbelievable?" Ron said, I told Vernon in 2003 this tractor wouldn't last 2 seasons. He's put 5,300 hours on it since then, and it's still running. Jason said, he took care of it. Ron said, that's what he told me. But I see farmers take care of equipment all the time. They still break down. This thing hasn't. Jason said, maybe it's just a good tractor. Ron stood there for a long moment looking at the Massey Ferguson. Then he said, we don't make them like this anymore. Jason said, no. Ron said, no. Everything now is emissions compliant, computer controlled, dealer dependent. You can't work on it yourself. You need diagnostic software. You need factory training. This thing, you can fix it with hand tools and a service manual. Jason said, that's why I wanted it. Ron said, smart. Then he walked back to his truck and left. Jason Deerfield still farms Vernon Kleist's 680 acres. He expanded to 1,500 acres in 2018. He bought a newer combine in 2019, a John Deere 9870 STS with 1,400 hours. He bought a used Massey Ferguson 8680 in 2020 for heavy tillage work, but he still runs the 3680. As of March 2023, it had 16,200 hours on it. Jason has replaced the clutch once, the alternator twice, and the water pump once. He rebuilt the hydraulic pump in 2021. Total maintenance costs since 2016, $3,100. The tractor starts every morning. It pulls every implement Jason hooks to it. It works. In 2022, Jason was at a farm machinery expo in Bloomington when a man approached him. The man was in his mid-60s, wearing a dealership jacket with a name tag that said Regional Sales Manager. You're Jason Deerfield, right? The man said. I am, Jason said. You bought Vernon Kleist's farm a few years back? I did. The man said, you still running that old 3680? Jason said, every day. The man shook his head. That tractor's become a legend in this territory. We use it in training now. Jason said, training for what? The man said, for showing new service managers what happens when a farmer actually maintains their equipment. Most guys don't. They run it hard, skip service intervals, then blame the machine when it breaks. Vernon never did that, and now you're doing the same thing. Jason said, I'm just following what he taught me. The man said, we sold that tractor new in 1987 for $42,000. It's now 36 years old with over 16,000 hours on it. If you calculate cost per hour, that machine has cost you and Vernon less than $1.10 an hour to own and operate. You know what the cost per hour is on a new tractor? Jason said, I don't. The man said, about $48, and that's if you keep it for 10 years and run it 800 hours a season. Jason said, so the old one's cheaper. The man said, by a factor of 40. Vernon Kleist is 82 years old now. He lives in the small house in Sullivan. He doesn't farm anymore. His son Aaron visits twice a year. His granddaughters are in high school. Vernon spends his days reading, watching the news, and sitting on his porch. He doesn't talk about farming much. But once a month, Jason Deerfield drives into town and picks Vernon up, and they drive out to the farm. Vernon walks through the machine shed. He looks at the equipment, and he stands in front of the Massey Ferguson 3680 for a long time. Still running? Vernon asks every time. Still running, Jason says every time. Vernon nods. He doesn't say anything else. He doesn't need to. The tractor says everything that needs to be said. In March of 2023, 20 years after Vernon bought the Massey Ferguson for $8,900, Jason brought the tractor to the annual farm show in Decatur. He parked it in the vintage equipment section next to a restored 1950 Farmall M and a 1965 John Deere 4020. A sign next to the Massey Ferguson said, 1987 MF 3680, 16th in 200 hours, still in daily use. People stopped to look at it. Old farmers, young farmers, dealership reps, equipment took pictures. They asked questions. They climbed into the cab and looked at the worn steering wheel, the cracked seat, the simple gauge cluster with no computer screen, no touchscreen, no GPS. One man, a farmer in his 70s, stood in front of the tractor for 5 minutes just staring at it. Then he turned to Jason and said, they don't make them like this anymore. Jason said, no, they don't. The man said, and that's a damn shame. Todd Messner, the neighbor who had laughed at Vernon in 2003, saw the tractor at the farm show. He stood at a distance watching people examine it. He didn't approach. He didn't ask questions. He just stood there for a few minutes, then walked away. He's 62 now. He sold his farm in 2021. He works full-time at the grain elevator in Sullivan. He drives past Vernon's old farm sometimes and sees the Massey Ferguson in the field and remembers the day at the auction when he told Vernon it wouldn't last 2 seasons. Kyle Reinhardt, the other neighbor who had mocked Vernon, quit farming in 2014. He moved to Florida. Nobody in Moultrie County has heard from him in years. Greg Bachman, the third neighbor, the one who farmed 3,200 acres and lost it all, works at a hardware store in Mattoon now. He doesn't talk about farming. When people ask him what happened, he just says the margins got too tight and the debt got too heavy. Ron Halstead, the service manager who told Vernon the tractor would blow up, retired in 2020. At his retirement party, someone asked him what the most surprising thing he'd seen in his career was. Ron said Vernon Kleist's 3680. The person asked why. Ron said, because I told him it wouldn't last and I was wrong. And being wrong about that taught me more about equipment than being right about anything else ever did. The Massey Ferguson 3680 is still running. It's 37 years old now. It has over 16,400 hours on it. It has never had a major engine failure. It has never had a transmission failure. It has never had a catastrophic breakdown that took it out of service for more than 3 days. It starts every morning. It pulls every load. It works. And it stands as proof that the farmer who spent $800–900 at an auction in 2003 while 3 men laughed at him understood something those men didn't. That equipment lasts as long as you make it last. That maintenance matters more than horsepower. That simplicity beats complexity. And that sometimes the machine everyone calls junk turns out to be the only one still running when the dust settles.